Mountain Man was a virgin at 40 until a woman asked him to stay in his barn during the storm. In the frozen Colorado highlands, a giant of a man lives alone, never once touched by love. 40 winters have passed without a wife, without a family, without a single kiss. But one deadly storm changes everything. A widow and her boy stumble through the snow, begging for shelter in his barn. He gives them fire and bread, never knowing it will set the whole valley ablaze with danger. Because men in town want more than her land. They want her gone. And they'll mock him, threaten him, and even forge the law to take what's not theirs. Yet the loneliest man in the mountains finds himself standing between a widow's hope and a railroad's greed. His secret shame exposed, his faith tested, his heart awakened for the very first time. Can a man who's never known love risk everything to protect it? Or will the storm outside be nothing compared to the storm coming for them both? Before we begin, I invite you to take a breath. This space is for the quiet believers. The ones who know small kindnesses can ripple into something greater. The bitter wind howled through the pines, driving needles of snow against Mark's weathered cabin. He stood frozen, lantern held high, studying the unexpected visitors who had stumbled out of the storm. The woman's face was pale with cold, her dark hair dusted white. The boy, no more than 7 or 8, pressed against her skirts, his small fingers clutching the rough fabric. Mark's throat felt tight. It had been years since he'd had proper company, let alone a woman and child seeking shelter. The familiar. Shame crept up his neck. He knew nothing of how to comfort or care for such guests. "The barn's this way, ma'am," he managed, his voice rough from disuse. He turned, leading them through the deepening snow. The woman stumbled, catching herself against the fence post. Without thinking, Mark reached out to steady her, then pulled back as if burned when his hand brushed her arm. "Thank you," she whispered, her breath forming clouds in the freezing air. "I'm Nika Jessup. This is my boy, Tommy." Mark nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "Mark Boone," he replied, fumbling with the heavy wooden latch on the barn door. The familiar smells of hay and leather greeted them as they stepped inside. His mule, old Jake, watched them with mild interest from his stall. "It ain't much, Mark," said, setting the lantern on a beam, "but it's dry. Storm might last till morning." He moved to the back corner where he kept spare blankets for his hunting trips. They were clean enough, if a bit rough. The boy hadn't said a word, but his eyes followed Mark's every move. Mark recognized that wariness. He'd seen it in young colts, ready to bolt at the slightest wrong move. He made his movements slow and deliberate as he handed the blankets to Nika. "Much obliged, Mr. Boone," she said, wrapping one around Tommy's shoulders. Her hands trembled with cold. "Our wagon wheel caught a rut about a mile back. We were hoping to make it to Silver Creek before nightfall." Mark glanced outside. The snow was falling harder now, the wind driving it sideways. "Silver Creek's near. 20 miles yet," he said. "Ain't safe to try it tonight." He hesitated, then added, "I can fetch some wood from the cabin. Get a proper fire going in here." Nika's relief was visible. "We don't want to be a burden." "No burden," Mark cut in, more abruptly than he'd meant to. He softened his voice. "Just wait here. I'll be right back." Outside, Mark leaned against the cabin wall, drawing deep breaths of the sharp winter air. His father's voice echoed in his memory. The good Lord tests a man's character by what he does when no one's watching. But Pa hadn't told him what to do when people showed up unexpected, looking to him for help. He gathered an armload of split wood from the pile he'd stacked earlier, grateful now for the extra work. When he returned to the barn, Nika had spread the blankets on a clean patch of hay. Tommy sat close beside her, his small face still pinched with worry. Mark built the fire in the old brazier he sometimes used when working late in the barn. His hands knew this task well, and soon flames crackled cheerfully, pushing back the darkness and cold. The boy's eyes widened at the sight. "Reckon you folks could use something hot to drink," Mark said, surprising himself. "That coffee brewing in the cabin." "Oh, we couldn't impose," Nika began, but Mark was already heading for the door. "No imposition," he said over his shoulder. "Just stay warm." In his cabin, Mark's hands shook slightly as he poured coffee into his 3 best tin cups, though truth be told, they were his only cups. He added extra sugar to one for the boy, remembering how his own father had done the same for him on cold nights that, when he returned, Tommy had edged closer to the fire, some of the wariness leaving his face as warmth returned to his limbs. Nika sat with her back straight, despite her evident exhaustion, dignity intact even in these reduced circumstances. Mark set the cups down carefully on an upturned crate near them. "Sugar's in the boys," he said, then retreated to his customary spot in the shadows. The lamplight caught Nika's profile as she helped Tommy with his cup, and something twisted in Mark's chest. She had a gentleness about her, even in hardship, that made him acutely aware of his own rough edges. The wind continued its assault outside, but in the barn, the fire popped and hissed companionably. Old Jake shuffled in his stall, and somewhere in the rafters, a barn owl called softly. Mark watched as color slowly returned to his guests' faces, and for the first time in years, his solitary world felt somehow incomplete. Morning light streamed through the barn's weathered boards, casting golden stripes across the hay-strewn floor. Nika blinked awake, momentarily disoriented until she felt Tommy's warm weight pressed against her side. The boy slept soundly, his face peaceful in the early light. The embers of last night's fire glowed faintly in the brazier, testifying to their host's attentiveness. He must have added wood through the night. Careful not to wake Tommy, Nika eased herself up from their makeshift bed in the loft. Her muscles protested after weeks of hard travel, but the hay had provided better rest than the cold ground they'd grown accustomed to. Through the barn's small window, she saw pristine snow blanketing the yard, glittering like scattered diamonds. In the sunrise, the crunch of her boots on fresh snow seemed impossibly loud in the morning stillness. Smoke curled from the cabin's chimney, and as she approached, savory smells drifted out to meet her. She hesitated at the door, suddenly conscious of her rumpled appearance, then knocked softly. "Come in," Mark's deep voice called. Inside, she found him bent over the cook stove, stirring a pot of porridge with careful concentration. He straightened quickly at her entrance, nearly bumping his head on the low-hanging pots. "Good morning, Mr. Boone," she said. "Ma'am." He gestured awkwardly toward the pot. "I thought, that is, if you and the boy are hungry." His words trailed off as he reached for 3 wooden bowls, almost dropping one in his haste. "That's very kind of you," Nika said, watching as he ladled portions with painstaking care. "Tommy will be grateful. He's always hungry these days." As if summoned by the mention of food, the cabin door creaked open and Tommy poked his head in. His hair stuck up at odd angles from sleep, and his eyes widened at the sight of breakfast. "Come on in, boy," Mark said gruffly, but with unexpected gentleness. "Got honey for the porridge, if you like." Tommy needed no further invitation. He slipped inside and claimed a seat at the simple table, watching intently as Mark drizzled honey over his bowl. The first spoonful brought a smile to the boy's face, the first real smile Nika had seen in weeks. "This is real good, mister," Tommy said between bites. Mark's weather-worn face softened. "Much obliged. My pa taught me to cook when I was about your size." Nika savored her own portion, surprised by the subtle flavors. "Your father taught you well," she said. Mark stared into his bowl. "Been gone 5 years now. Just me here since then." His voice held a weight of loneliness that struck a chord in Nika's heart. After breakfast, Mark went about his morning chores while Nika tidied their sleeping area in the barn. She watched through the door as he moved with quiet efficiency, checking on livestock and breaking ice from water troughs. His massive frame belied a gentleness she hadn't expected, especially in how he handled the animals. The morning stretched on, warm enough now to begin thinking about their wagon. Nika gathered her courage and approached Mark as he split more. "Firewood, Mr. Boone," she began. "We're grateful for your hospitality, but we should move on once the wagon's mended." The axe paused mid-swing. Something flickered across Mark's face, disappointment, perhaps before he nodded. "Got tools in the shed," he said, "and a spare mule if you need it." That wheel looked pretty rough. Evening found them sharing another meal in the cabin, this time a hearty stew that had simmered all afternoon. The lamp cast warm shadows on the walls as Tommy peppered Mark with questions about life in the mountains. "You really catch bears?" the boy asked, eyes wide. "Sometimes," Mark answered, seeming to forget his usual reticence. "Mostly trap beaver and marten, though. Good fur brings fair price in town." "What's a marten?" Mark's explanation of mountain creatures and their habits had Tommy leaning forward, spoon forgotten in his bowl. Nika watched the interaction with growing warmth. This quiet mountain man, for all his awkwardness, had a way of making them feel safe that she hadn't experienced in a long time. But as the evening wore on, Mark grew increasingly uneasy under their attention. He cleared his throat and stood suddenly. "Best turn in," he said. "Getting late." Later, lying alone in his narrow bed, Mark stared at the cabin's familiar ceiling. The sounds were different tonight, no creaking of empty rooms or hollow whistle of wind through cracks. Instead, he could hear faint movements from the barn, reminding him of his guests. He thought about Tommy's eager questions and Nika's gentle voice, so different from the silence he'd grown used to. What would it mean, he wondered, to have such sounds become regular parts of his days? The thought both thrilled and terrified him, and sleep was long in coming. Dawn painted the sky in gentle pinks and golds as Nika and Tommy prepared for departure. The broken wagon wheel leaned against the barn wall, newly mended with Mark's help. He worked silently, methodically checking the repairs and testing the spokes with strong fingers that moved more stiffly than usual. Tommy darted around the yard, gathering their scattered belongings while Nika folded the borrowed blankets. The morning air held a crisp bite, but the storm clouds had fled, leaving behind a pristine blanket of snow that sparkled in the early light. "Reckon that wheel'll hold now," Mark said, his voice rough with something more than just the morning chill. He adjusted the harness on his spare mule, avoiding Nika's eyes. "You've been more than kind, Mr. Boone," Nika replied softly. She placed the folded blankets on the wagon seat, her movements slow, as if she too was reluctant to hasten their departure. The sharp crack of hoofbeats on frozen ground cut through the quiet morning. A rider approached at a brisk trot, his badge glinting in the sunlight. Deputy Harlan Vos sat tall in his saddle, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth as he surveyed the scene before him. Well, well," he drawled, reining his horse too. "A stop, if it ain't the Widow Jessup." His eyes flickered over the loaded wagon, taking in the signs of their overnight stay. "Seems you've found yourself a protector." Nika's spine stiffened. "Good morning, Deputy Voss." The deputy ignored her greeting, turning instead to Mark. "Careful there, Boone. This one comes with more trouble than you might expect." He pulled a folded paper from his vest. "Speaking of which, got some interesting news from town. Seems your late husband left more than just debts to common gamblers, Mrs. Jessup." Color drained from Nika's face. "What are you talking about?" "Railroad agent. Came through yesterday. Samuel Cutter's his name. Claims your husband sold water rights before his unfortunate passing." Harlan's smile widened. "Makes your claim a mite complicated, don't it?" "That's impossible," Nika protested. "Those rights weren't his to sell. The claim is in my name." "Might want to take that up with Mr. Cutter." Harlan's gaze slid to Mark, who had moved closer to Nika's side. "Though I doubt your new friend here can help much. What do you know about water rights, Boone?" Can't imagine you learned much about the law hiding up in these hills all these years. Mark's hands clenched at his sides. She's got a right to fair treatment, he said, voice quiet but firm. The deputy laughed. And you'll stand up for her, will you? Man who's never even courted a woman, let alone married one. He shook his head in mock pity. Folks in town still talk about how you fled up here after your pa died. Wouldn't know the first thing about helping a widow and her boy. Mark's face flushed dark red. His mouth opened, but no words came out, confirming the deputy's cruel words. Leave him be, Nika said sharply, stepping forward. Mr. Boone has shown more true Christian charity than those who'd mock an honest man's kindness. Harlan's expression hardened. Charity won't save your claim, Mrs. Jessup. Best accept that before things get difficult. He gathered his reins. Mr. Cutter will be expecting to meet with you soon. Don't keep him waiting too long. With a touch of his hat brim and a final smirk, he wheeled his horse and rode away. Silence fell heavy in his wake. Tommy pressed close to his mother's side, his earlier cheerfulness gone. Mark stood frozen, shame written clear across his features. I'm sorry, he finally managed. What he said about me, it's true. Never courted, never. He swallowed hard. Reckon I ain't much help to anybody. Nika turned to face him fully. You took in 2 strangers during a storm. Fed us, sheltered us, asked nothing in return. Her voice was gentle but firm. That makes you a good man, Mr. Boone, no matter what. Cruel people might say. Mark's eyes met hers briefly before dropping away. What will you do now? Nika's shoulders sagged slightly. I don't know. That water claim, it's all we have left. If James truly sold it before he died, she trailed off, looking at Tommy with worry in her eyes. The boy stared at his boots, kicking at the snow. Storm had cleared, leaving behind a bright winter morning, but Nika felt colder than she had in the darkest part of the blizzard. The path ahead, which had seemed so clear just moments ago, now disappeared into uncertainty like tracks covered by fresh snow. Evening crept in with long shadows and falling temperatures. Mark added logs to the cooking fire, stealing glances at Nika and Tommy as they settled around his rough-hewn table. The deputy's threats hung heavy in the air, making the thought of them traveling alone seem foolish. Best you stay tonight, Mark said, stirring the bean pot. Deputy might be watching the road. Nika nodded, her fingers absently smoothing Tommy's unruly hair. Thank you, I reckon you're right about that. She was quiet for a moment, then drew a folded paper from her apron pocket. There's something I should tell you, Mr. Boone, seeing as we're imposing on your hospitality. The lamplight cast a warm glow as she spread the document on the table. Mark leaned closer, squinting at the official writing. James, my husband, he filed water rights on Cottonwood Creek before he passed, she explained. The creek that runs through this valley, feeding both your land and what would have been our homestead. Her fingers traced the creek's path on the mapped portion. It's all we have left now, but it might be enough to start fresh if we can hold. Onto it, Mark's brow furrowed as he studied the paper. Railroad men usually get what they want, he said quietly. Seen it happen before. They find ways. But it's not right. Tommy piped up from his place by the fire. Ma says the paper's got her name on it, too. Hush now, Nika said gently, though pride flickered in her eyes at her son's sense of justice. She turned back to Mark. I know it won't be easy. But this claim, it's our only chance at survival. Mark nodded slowly, troubled by how easily men, like Deputy Voss and the railroad agent, could strip away a widow's rights. The room fell quiet, except for the pop and crackle of burning wood dot after their simple supper of beans and cornbread. Nika rose and began gathering the tin plates. Let me help clean up, she offered. It's the least I can do. Oh, you don't need to, Mark started. But she was already moving toward the wash basin. Tommy curled up by the fire, eyelids growing heavy as the warmth and full belly worked their magic. Mark watched in awkward amazement as Nika moved about. His cabin with quiet efficiency, setting things to rights as naturally as if she'd done it 100 times before. "Been a long while since anyone sat at my table," he admitted softly, not wanting to wake the dozing boy. "Reckon I'd forgotten how it ought to be." Nika paused in her work, studying him with gentle eyes. "Sometimes the Lord sends us reminders of what we're missing, even when we didn't know we were missing it." Later, after Nika and Tommy had retired to the barn's loft, Mark knelt beside his bed. The cabin felt different somehow, both emptier and fuller at the same time. His prayer came out rough but honest in the darkness. "Lord," he whispered, "I ain't much good with people, you know that. Never learned the proper way of things." He paused, struggling with the words. "But that woman and her boy, they need help. Real help, not just a barn to sleep in. I don't know what to do, but I want to do right by them. Show me how, if it be your will." Unknown to Mark, Nika had come down from the loft to fetch Tommy's forgotten jacket. Through the barn wall, his earnest words reached her faintly. She stood very still, listening to this private moment of devotion from a man most thought to. Rough for tender feelings, something stirred in her heart, not pity, but recognition. Here was a soul as lonely as her own, yet still reaching out to help others despite his fears and doubts. She thought of how the townspeople mocked his solitary ways, never seeing the kind heart beneath his awkward manner. Fresh snow began to fall outside, tiny flakes drifting past the barn window. Nika watched them dance in the darkness, each one catching the faint moonlight before joining its fellows in the growing blanket below. The snow wrapped the cabin and barn in hushed white, a fragile peace descending with each silent flake. She gathered Tommy's jacket close, breathing in the mingled scents of hay and wood smoke. Tomorrow would bring its own troubles, but for now, in this quiet moment, she felt something she hadn't experienced in a long while: hope, as delicate and pure as the newly fallen snow. Days melted into a gentle rhythm at the cabin, each sunrise bringing new lessons in companionship. Mark found himself rising earlier than usual, eager to start the day's work with Tommy at his side. The boy's enthusiasm for learning warmed something long dormant in Mark's heart. "Here's how you check if the wood's dry enough," Mark demonstrated one morning, showing Tommy how to split a piece of kindling. The boy watched with rapt attention, his small hands mimicking Mark's movements. "See how it snaps clean? That's what you want." Tommy's face lit up when he successfully split his first piece. "Did you see that, Mr. Boone? I did it just like you." "Showed me." "That you did," Mark answered, his usual gruffness softening into pride. Later that day, they worked together mending the north fence line, Tommy handing up tools and asking endless questions about the mountains and wildlife. Mark discovered he had more words than he'd thought when it came to sharing what he knew. Inside the cabin, Nika worked miracles with Mark's simple provisions. The smell of fresh bread and hearty stews replaced the lonely scent of bachelor cooking. She stretched cornmeal and dried beans into filling meals that brought them together around the table each evening. "Never thought these old stores could taste so good," Mark admitted one night, finishing his second bowl of bean soup. Nika smiled, pleased. "Sometimes it just takes a woman's touch to bring out the best in things." She glanced at him, and Mark found himself smiling back, something that came easier with each passing day. But their peaceful routine carried whispers into town. At the general store, Mark overheard snippets of conversation that made his neck burn. "That mountain hermit's got himself a widow woman up there. Ain't natural, him being such a loner all these years. Wonder what she's really after." Mark hurried through his purchases, keeping his head down. But the rumors weren't the worst of their troubles. That evening, Nika's hands trembled as she stirred the supper pot. "The railroad's pressing harder," she confided, her voice low so Tommy couldn't hear from where he played by the fire. "Their agent's been asking questions about water rights all through the valley. They're offering to buy some, threatening others. She met Mark's eyes. "I've heard they don't always play fair, that they'll forge documents to get what they want." Mark's stomach knotted. All his life, he'd avoided confrontation, preferring the simple peace of his solitary existence. But watching Nika's courage in the face of such threats stirred something in him, a desire to protect what was right, even if it meant standing up to powerful men. "We'll figure something out," he said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "Your claim's legal. They can't just take it." Nika gave him a grateful look, then noticed a tear in his shirt sleeve. "Here, let me mend that for you," she offered, reaching for her sewing basket. Later, as lamplight cast warm shadows across the cabin walls, Nika worked on his shirt while Mark carved a small wooden horse for Tommy. The comfortable silence between them felt like a gift. "Hold still a moment," Nika murmured, leaning closer to tie off a thread. Her hand brushed his arm as she smoothed the mended fabric. Mark froze, his face flooding with heat at the innocent contact. It had been so long since anyone had touched him with such casual kindness. He felt clumsy and aware of every breath. Looking up, he caught Nika's gentle smile, not mocking his discomfort, but understanding it. In her eyes, he saw recognition of his shy nature and acceptance of it. Something shifted in his chest, like spring ice breaking up after a long winter. Tommy's voice broke the moment. "Ma, Mr. Boone showed me mountain lion tracks today. He says they're bigger than my whole hand." "Did he now?" Nika turned to her son, but her smile lingered, warming Mark like sunshine. That night, after Nika and Tommy had gone to sleep in the loft room he'd cleared for them, Mark sat alone by the dying fire. He thought about how his quiet cabin had transformed. These past days, filled now with Tommy's laughter, Nika's cooking, and conversations that came easier each evening. He thought about the threats gathering in town like storm clouds, and for the first time in his life, he felt ready to weather them. Not for his own sake, but for the small family that had somehow awakened his heart. The wagon wheels creaked as Mark guided his team down the rutted road toward town. Nika sat beside him on the bench, while Tommy bounced excitedly between them, pointing at everything he saw. The morning sun cast long shadows across the fresh snow, making the valley glitter like scattered diamonds. "First time I've had company riding into town," Mark admitted, his hands tight on the reins. "Usually just me and the mule." "Well, we needed supplies anyway," Nika said softly. "No sense in hiding away forever." As they approached the main street, heads turned. Women paused in their sweeping to watch, whispering behind gloved hands. Mark heard snippets of their words carried on the winter wind. "That widow's got real courage, taking up with the mountain man. At least she's found someone decent to look after her boy." The men's comments cut deeper, especially near the livery stable where several ranch hands lounged. "Looks like old Boone's got himself a barn full of strays now. Never thought we'd see him with a woman, let alone playing father." Mark's neck burned, but Nika touched his arm lightly. "Let them talk," she whispered. "They don't know you like." "We do." At the general store, Mark helped Nika and Tommy down from the wagon. Inside, the warm air smelled of coffee and leather. Two well-dressed men stood near the counter, their fine coats marking them as outsiders. Mark recognized them as railroad agents from their watchful eyes and citified manner. As Nika selected flour and other staples, one of the agents approached, twirling his mustache. "Mrs. Jessup, isn't it? We've been hoping to discuss your water rights, particularly that creek claim your late husband filed." "I have nothing to discuss about that," Nika replied firmly, keeping her eyes on her shopping list. "The railroad's offering fair prices," the man pressed. "Better to sell now than face complications later." Mark stepped closer to Nika, his height casting a shadow over the agent. "Reckon she said she's not interested." The agent's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Just being neighborly, Mr. Boone. Though I hear you've become quite interested in your neighbor's affairs lately." Tommy pressed against Mark's leg, sensing the tension. Nika squared her shoulders and moved to the counter, ignoring the agents completely as she paid for their supplies. The winter air felt cleansing after the store's charged atmosphere. As they loaded the wagon, the church bell rang out clear and bright. Pastor Higgins appeared on the steps of the white-painted building, his kind face breaking into a genuine smile. "Mark Boone and Mrs. Jessup." He hurried over, greeting them warmly. "What a pleasure to see you both. And this young man must be Tommy." The boy grinned shyly as the pastor ruffled his hair. "We've missed seeing folks at services," Pastor Higgins continued. "You must join us for the Christmas gathering next week. The whole valley comes together, music, food, fellowship. No arguments now," he added as Mark began to protest. "The Lord's house welcomes everyone, especially at Christmas." Nika thanked him graciously while Mark shuffled his boots in the snow, uncomfortable with the invitation, but touched by the pastor's sincere welcome. That evening, back at the cabin, Mark struggled to find words as they sat by the fire after supper. Tommy had fallen asleep in the corner, wrapped in a quilt. "I'm sorry about town," he finally managed. "All that talk, those agents watching you, I ain't much good at dealing with such things. Never understood how to talk proper to women or handle folk who mean harm." Nika looked up from her mending. "Mark Boone, do you think I care about proper talk? You've given us shelter, shown kindness to my boy, stood beside us today without hesitation." She set her sewing aside. "That means more than any smooth words or fancy manners. I just want to protect you both," he admitted roughly. "But I don't know if I'm strong enough." "The Lord gives strength where it's needed," Nika said softly. "Shall we pray about it?" Mark nodded, and they bowed their heads together. Nika's quiet voice filled the cabin as she asked for guidance and protection. Tommy stirred in his sleep, listening even in dreams. As they said, "Amen," Mark felt a warmth spread through his chest unlike anything he'd known before. It wasn't the heat of embarrassment or anger, but something deeper, like sunrise breaking over mountain peaks, bringing light to places long in shadow. He looked at Nika in the firelight, at Tommy sleeping peacefully, and for the first time in years, his cabin felt truly like home. December settled over the valley like a thick white blanket. Each morning, Mark woke to find fresh snow dusting the windowsills, transforming his humble homestead into a sparkling wonderland. The sound of Nika and Tommy stirring in the loft above brought a smile to his weathered face, a new routine that warmed his heart more than any fire could. In the kitchen, Nika stood at the rough-hewn table, her hands covered in flour. "Here," she said, motioning Mark over. "Let me show you how to knead properly." Mark's large hands hesitated over the bread dough. Might be too rough for such delicate work. "Nonsense," Nika laughed, placing her smaller hands over his. "Even the strongest hands can learn gentleness. Push from your palms like this." Together they worked the dough, Mark marveling at how something so simple could feel so right. The warmth of her touch lingered long after she stepped away to check the stove. Tommy sat cross-legged by the fire, watching intently as Mark demonstrated how to hold a whittling knife. "Keep your thumb clear," Mark instructed, guiding the boys. "Small hands. Let the blade do the work." Slowly, a wooden horse emerged from the pine block. Tommy's eyes shone with pride. "Look, Mama," he called out. "Mr. Mark's teaching me to make toys." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Nika beamed, her eyes meeting Mark's across the room. Something unspoken passed between them, gratitude, understanding. Perhaps even more. Evenings brought them together around the fire, sharing stories and simple pleasures. Tommy's laughter rang through the cabin as Mark told tales of his early days learning to trap. Mika's quiet chuckles joined in, and Mark found himself laughing more than he had in years. One afternoon, as Mark split wood behind the cabin, the sharp crack of hooves on frozen ground caught his attention. Deputy Harlan Voss rode up, his badge glinting dully in the winter sun. Quite the cozy setup you got here, Boone, Harlan drawled, not bothering to dismount. His eyes narrowed as he surveyed the homestead. Mighty interesting, how you've taken such a shine to the widow's situation. Mark set down his axe carefully, remembering his father's words. True strength shows itself in restraint, son. Something you need, deputy? Mark kept his voice level, though his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Harlan's horse stamped restlessly in the snow. Just giving friendly advice. Some business in this valley ain't yours to meddle in. Water rights, property claims, best leave that to folks who understand such matters. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Shame if anything happened to upset. Your little arrangement here. Mark took a step forward, his jaw tight. The deputy's hand twitched toward his gun belt, but Mark held himself still. After a long moment, Harlan wheeled his horse around and rode off, leaving dark hoofprints in the pristine snow. That evening, after Tommy had gone to sleep, Nika found Mark still brooding by the fire. She settled into the chair beside him, her hands busy with mending. I heard the deputy today, she said softly. I never meant to bring trouble to your door, Mark. Never wanted to be a burden on anyone. Mark turned to her, firelight dancing across his features. You ain't no burden, Nika. Far from it. He paused, searching for the right words. Truth is, I've been praying for years, asking the Lord to fill this empty house with something more than just my lonesome self. Never thought he'd answer quite like this, but, he trailed off, his heart trembling with hope he scarcely dared to name. Tommy feels safe here, Nika said, her voice gentle. For the first time since his father passed, he's sleeping through the night. No more nightmares about having nowhere to call home. And you? Mark asked, barely above a whisper. Do you feel safe? Nika set down her sewing, meeting his gaze steadily. I feel more than safe, Mark. I feel like we found where we belong. The fire crackled softly, casting warm shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, snow continued to fall, but inside, something was blooming fragile as spring's first flowers, but just as determined to grow. Frost glittered on the wagon wheels as Mark hitched up his team in the early Christmas Eve twilight. His father's old wool coat felt stiff and formal after years in the cedar chest, but Nika had pressed it carefully, making the dark fabric look almost new. He tugged at the collar, as nervous as a schoolboy. When Nika emerged from the cabin with Tommy, Mark's breath caught. She wore a simple blue dress with a white shawl, her hair neatly pinned back. Tommy bounced beside her in his Sunday best, clutching a small package of cookies they'd baked together. You look right fine, Mark, Nika said softly, adjusting his lapel with gentle hands. Your father would be proud. Mark helped them into the wagon, his large hands steady despite his racing heart. The crisp evening air carried the sound of distant church bells as they rode toward town, their breath-forming clouds in the December chill. Light spilled from the church windows, warming the snowy yard where dozens of wagons already stood. Mark's hands tightened on the reins as heads turned to watch their arrival. He'd avoided gatherings for so long. The attention made his neck burn. But then Pastor Higgins strode forward, his weathered face creased in a genuine smile. Mark Boone. Brings joy to my heart to see you here. He clasped Mark's hand warmly. Mrs. Jessup, young Tommy, welcome, welcome. Come in where it's warm. Inside, the church glowed with lamplight and pine boughs. The scent of cinnamon and coffee mingled with fresh-cut evergreen. Tommy's eyes went wide at the Christmas tree, decorated with paper chains and tiny candles. Tommy, called Jimmy Fletcher, the blacksmith's son, come see what we made. A group of children gathered around a nativity scene, and Tommy looked questioningly at his mother. Go on, Nika encouraged. Tommy darted off, soon laughing with the others. Mark stood awkwardly until Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, approached Nika. We could use another voice in the choir, dear. Do you know Silent Night? I used to sing it with my mother, Nika replied. She squeezed Mark's arm. Will you be all right? He nodded, watching as she joined the group of women gathering near the piano. Her voice rose clear and sweet with the others, filling the church with familiar carols. Pride swelled in his chest. She belonged here, among good people. As the evening progressed, Mark found himself drawn into conversations he'd avoided. For years, Farmer Jenkins asked about his trap lines. The cooper wanted advice about mountain weather. Even the sheriff nodded respectfully, a marked change from his deputy's hostility. When it came time for hymns, the congregation stood together. Mark knew the words from childhood but hadn't sung them since his father passed. As "O Come, All the Faithful" began, he felt Nika slip quietly beside him. Her hand found his, warm and small against his calloused palm. The touch startled him, then anchored him. Tears pricked his eyes as their voices joined the others. Here, in this moment, he wasn't the mountain recluse or the awkward loner. He was simply a man, standing beside a woman he'd grown to care for deeply. Surrounded by community. Near the back doors, he glimpsed several railroad men watching with dark expressions, Samuel Cutter among them. But even their presence couldn't dim the warmth in his heart. After the service, neighbors lingered to share Christmas wishes. Tommy showed off the wooden figure he'd painted for the Nativity, beaming with pride when Mark praised his work. Women pressed small gifts into Nika's hands, jars of preserves, fresh bread, a hand-knit scarf for Tommy. The ride home was quiet but content, stars brilliant in the clear night sky. Tommy fell asleep against his mother's shoulder, clutching his painted shepherd figure. At the cabin, Mark lifted the sleeping boy and carried him inside. When he returned, Nika stood in the yard, face turned up to the stars. "Thank you, Mark," she whispered as he approached. "I haven't felt so alive since before James died. Tonight reminded me what it means to have a real home, a place where people care." Mark's throat tightened with emotion. "I reckon I forgot what that felt like myself." He looked at their little cabin, warm light spilling from its windows. "Truth is, I don't want this night to end." Nika's eyes shone in the starlight. "Perhaps it doesn't have to," she said softly. "Perhaps it's just the beginning." They stood together in the peaceful night, their breath mingling in the cold air, while inside their cabin, the Christmas fire burned warm and bright. The peaceful starlight shattered as shadows detached themselves from the dark barn. 3 men emerged, their forms backlit by Mark's lantern. Samuel Cutter's polished boots crunched in the snow as he stepped forward, flanked by 2 burly associates. "Evening, Mrs. Jessup." Cutter's voice sliced through the cold air. "Seems we have some business to discuss." Mark moved protectively in front of Nika, his large frame casting a longer shadow. "This here's private property." "That's precisely the matter at hand." Cutter withdrew papers from his coat, the white sheet stark against the night. "These documents might interest you, Mrs. Jessup, particularly your late husband's signature at the bottom." Nika's breath caught. She stepped around Mark, taking the papers with trembling hands. In the lantern light, familiar handwriting sprawled. Across the bottom of the deed, James's distinctive scrawl, "Selling their water rights 3 years ago." "No," she whispered, the paper shaking in her grip. "He wouldn't." "Oh, but he did." Cutter's smile gleamed. "Sold the rights for a tidy sum. Spent it all at the tables in Denver, I imagine." Mark watched helplessly as color drained from Nika's face. Her shoulders sagged under the weight of betrayal. "Course we've been generous," Cutter continued, letting you believe you still had claim to it. "But now," he gestured to his men, who held torches, "time's up. Either clear out peaceful like, or we'll have to be more persuasive. Starting with that fine barn of yours, Bone." Mark's hands clenched into fists. "You're threatening an honest woman and her child." "No, sir," Cutter's voice hardened. "I'm enforcing a legal contract. One that's been valid for years while she's been squatting on railroad property." Nika pressed the papers back into Cutter's hands, her voice hollow. "You've made your point. Sunrise tomorrow. Cutter mounted his horse. "We'll return with more men. And if you're still here," he lifted his torch meaningfully, "well, dry wood burns quick in winter." The three riders melted into the darkness, hoofbeats fading into the night. Mark touched Nika's shoulder, but she pulled away, hurrying toward the cabin. Inside, Tommy still slept peacefully near the fire. Nika sank into a chair, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "He lied," she whispered. "All those months I nursed him through the fever, believing we still had a future. He'd already sold it away." Mark knelt beside her chair. "We'll fight this. I've got savings. We can hire a lawyer." "No," Nika wiped her eyes. "I won't drag you into this mess. You've been too good to us already." She looked around the cabin. At the home they'd begun to build together. "We'll leave at first light. Nika, please." Mark's voice cracked. "You and Tommy, you've brought life back to this place." "To me." She touched his weathered cheek, her eyes full of pain. "And you've given us shelter when we needed it most. But I won't be the reason they burn your home. I couldn't bear it. Then we'll go together. Find new land." "Mark." She cut him off gently. "You belong here. This valley is in your blood. I won't take that from you." He stood and paced the cabin, desperation rising. "Where will you go?" "My sister's in Kansas. We'll manage." Nika began gathering Tommy's things, each movement heavy with finality. Mark watched her pack, his heart splintering. Every item she tucked away felt like another piece of his dream crumbling. The family he'd begun to love, the future he'd dared to imagine, all dissolving like snow in spring. In his small bedroom, he lay rigid on his bed, listening to Nika's quiet movements in the main room. Sleep was impossible. His mind raced through options, searching for solutions, but found only dead ends. The law was clear. Even if forged, the papers bore James's signature. Without proof of fraud, they had no recourse. The night stretched endless, each tick of the clock bringing dawn closer. Mark pressed his palms against his eyes, fighting tears he hadn't shed since his father died. He'd lived alone for so long, convinced himself he was content in his solitude. But now, facing the return to that emptiness, he felt hollow inside. Through the thin wall, he heard Nika's muffled sobs. The sound tore at him, but he honored her privacy. Sometimes, he knew, grief needed its own space. Still, every tear she shed was like a physical pain in his chest. Tomorrow his cabin would echo with silence again. No small boots by the door, no gentle humming as dinner cooked, no child's laughter or woman's smile to warm the corners of his world. Just memories of what might have been, haunting these rooms like ghosts. Dawn crept over the mountains, painting the snow-laden clouds in shades of steel gray. Inside Mark's cabin, the sounds of quiet packing echoed against the walls. Nika folded their few belongings with careful hands, each movement weighted with sadness. Tommy sat at the table, pushing his breakfast around his plate, his usual appetite. Gone. Mark stood by the window, watching the sky lighten. His shoulders felt heavy, as if carrying the weight of the mountain itself. The coffee in his cup had grown cold, untouched since he'd poured it an hour ago. "The wagon's ready," he said finally, his voice rough. He'd spent the pre-dawn hours checking every wheel, every trace, making sure they'd travel safely. It was all he could offer now. Tommy looked up, his bottom lip trembling. "I don't want to go, Mama." Nika paused in her packing, pressing a hand to her eyes. "We have to, sweetheart. Get your coat on now." Mark helped the boy with his buttons, his large fingers clumsy with emotion. Tommy threw his arms around Mark's neck, holding tight. "Can't you come with us?" Kneeling down to the boy's level, Mark placed his hands on Tommy's shoulders. "Listen here, son. A man's got to keep his promises, right?" Tommy nodded, sniffling. "Well, I'm promising you right now. I will always protect you and your mama, no matter where you are. You understand? But how can you protect us if we're gone?" Mark's throat tightened. Sometimes protecting folks means letting them go when they need to, but that don't mean I'll stop caring, not ever. Nika stood by the door, clutching their last bundle. Tommy, it's time. Mark helped them into the wagon, tucking blankets around, their legs against the morning chill. His hands lingered on the rough wool, memorizing the moment. Nika's eyes met his, brimming with tears she wouldn't let fall. Mark, she began. I know, he whispered. He stepped back, forcing himself to let go. Nika clicked to the horses. The wagon wheels creaked as they turned, leaving deep tracks in the fresh snow. Tommy twisted in his seat, waving until his mother gently turned him forward. Mark stood rooted in place, watching the wagon grow smaller against the white landscape. The morning light caught Nika's hair beneath her shawl, gleaming like copper. His chest ached with each beat of his heart as they passed the stand of pines that marked his property line. Then, in a moment that felt like losing his father all over again, they disappeared from view. The silence pressed in around him. He forced himself through his morning chores, feeding the stock, checking the chicken coop, bringing in more firewood. Each task felt hollow without Tommy's eager questions or Nika's gentle presence nearby. Inside the cabin, evidence of their brief life together lingered everywhere. A small whittled horse Tommy had left on the windowsill. The smell of Nika's bread, still clinging to the kitchen. Her neat stitches in his mended shirt hanging by the fire. As evening settled over the valley, Mark knelt before the hearth. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, reminding him of all the nights they'd sat here together, a family in the making. His prayers, usually simple and straightforward, spilled out in anguish. Lord, he whispered, I ain't never asked for much, been content with my solitude, or at least I thought I was. He pressed his forehead to his clasped hands. But you brought them here, through that storm, to my door. The only place for miles they could have found shelter. Nika's words echoed in his memory, how he'd been the only man to show her true mercy, to treat her and Tommy with respect instead of judgment. His father had taught him that kindness wasn't weakness, but strength wearing its Sunday clothes. Can't believe you'd bring them here just to take them away, he continued, his voice rough with emotion. Can't believe you'd let me see what a family feels like, only to return me to silence. The fire popped and sparked, while outside, snow began falling in thick, quiet flakes. But inside Mark's heart, something else was falling into place, a certainty that grew stronger with each breath. God hadn't brought Nika and Tommy to his door just to abandon them to the railroad's greed. He hadn't placed this love in his heart just to let it wither. Mark rose from his knees, a new resolve burning in his chest. The cabin might be empty tonight, but he wouldn't let it stay that way. Not when everything that mattered was riding away in a wagon, carrying his heart with them, through the window. The snow continued its silent descent, blanketing the world in white. But Mark barely noticed the storm now, his mind already turning to what needed to be done. The railroad men might have their papers and their threats, but they didn't know the strength of a quiet man's love once awakened. Morning light streamed through the cabin windows as Mark pulled on his heavy coat. His mind was set, though his hands trembled slightly as he saddled his most reliable mule. The animal sensed his tension, shifting restlessly beneath the worn leather. The ride into town felt longer than usual, each hoof beat echoing his racing thoughts. What if he was wrong? What if standing up now only brought more trouble? But the memory of Tommy's tears and Nika's quiet dignity steeled his resolve. The church stood silent against the morning sky, its weathered boards glowing golden in the early light. Mark tied his mule to the hitching post, noting how his knuckles had gone white from gripping the reins too tight. Inside, Pastor Higgins sat at his desk, reading through his worn Bible. He looked up as Mark's shadow darkened the doorway, a warm smile crossing his face. Mark Boone, the pastor said, rising. I missed seeing you and the Jessops at service yesterday. Mark removed his hat, twisting the brim in his hands. That's partly why I'm here, Pastor. The railroad men came. They're claiming Nika's water rights with forged papers. She left yesterday morning. The pastor's smile faded. Sit down. Son, tell me everything. Mark settled into a chair, the wood creaking beneath his weight. As he explained the situation, Pastor Higgins listened intently, his weathered face growing grave. Your father, the pastor said suddenly, interrupting Mark's account. Wasn't he the one who surveyed this valley years ago? Before the railroad. Even laid eyes on our town? Mark straightened. Yes, sir. Did all the original water rights surveys himself? Wait here. Pastor Higgins moved to a large chest in the corner, its oak surface dulled with age. He lifted the heavy lid, revealing stacks of leather-bound books in folders. Your father kept copies of everything with the church. Said someone needed to guard the truth. They spent the next hour searching through dusty ledgers and yellowed papers. Mark's hands shook as he recognized his father's careful handwriting. The precise drawings of creek beds and property lines. Here, Pastor Higgins exclaimed, pulling out a stack of maps. And look, these are notarized. Your father documented every water claim in the valley. According to these records, that creek was never legally transferred, not to the railroad or anyone else. Mark studied the documents, his heart pounding. His father's voice seemed to whisper from the pages. Always keep records straight, son. Truth needs proof to stand on. The sheriff needs to see these, Mark said, gathering the papers carefully. The walk to the sheriff's office felt like stepping into battle. Mark had avoided confrontation his whole life, preferring the quiet of his mountain to the complications of town. But now, with each step, he felt his father's strength flowing through him. Sheriff Wilson sat behind his desk, boots propped up, reading a newspaper. He lowered it slowly as Mark and Pastor Higgins entered. Boone, the sheriff nodded. Unusual to see you in town 2 days running. Mark laid the documents on the desk. Need you to look at these, Sheriff. They prove the railroad's claim on Widow Jessup's water rights is false. The sheriff's boots hit the floor with a thud. He leaned forward, examining the papers with narrowed eyes. Minutes ticked by as he read, the only sound the rustle of paper and the tick of the wall clock. Finally, he looked up. These are proper documents, right enough. But you know those railroad men don't care about paper truth. They've got money and guns backing their claims. So you won't help? Mark's voice was quiet but firm. The sheriff sighed. Didn't say that. The law's the law. But this will take more than just showing papers. You'll have to face them publicly. Make them back down where everyone can see. He paused. You ready for that kind of fight, Boone? Mark thought of Nika's gentle strength, of Tommy's trust in him. Yes, sir, I reckon I am. Back at his cabin that evening, Mark cleaned his father's old rifle. He didn't plan to use it, but its presence might remind the railroad men that mountain folk weren't helpless. His hands moved surely over the weapon, checking every part, while his mind rehearsed what needed saying. The lamp burned low as he knelt by his bed. Lord, he whispered, I ain't asking for courage I don't have. Just help me use what you already gave me. He thought of his father's legacy of truth, of Nika's faith in him, of Tommy's innocent love. Help me stand strong tomorrow. Not just for them, but for what's right. Outside, an owl called into the darkness. Mark checked his mule one last time, making sure all was ready for morning. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought, but tonight, he had truth on his side and a clear purpose in his heart. Dawn painted the Colorado sky in soft rose and gold as Mark guided his mule down the mountain path toward town. His father's survey maps lay secure in his saddlebag, each step bringing him closer to the confrontation he'd spent his whole life avoiding. The morning air bit sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke from distant chimneys. Depot came into view, its weathered boards dark against the brightening sky. A crowd had already gathered, their breath-forming clouds in the cold air. Railroad workers hefted crates from a newly arrived wagon while Agent Cutter supervised. His tailored coat and polished boots, marking him as a man apart from the townspeople. Mark's mule's hooves crunched on the frozen ground as he approached. Faces turned toward him, storekeepers, ranchers, women with shawls pulled tight. He recognized them all, though he'd kept his distance for years. Now they watched him with curious eyes. Sensing something different in his bearing, Deputy Harlan stood near the depot steps, hand resting casually on his gun belt. His lips curled into a familiar sneer as Mark dismounted. "Well, if it ain't the mountain hermit, come to town 2 days running. Missing your house guests already, Boone." Mark ignored the jibe, though his cheeks burned. He withdrew the leather folder of maps from his saddlebag, holding them high so all could see. His voice, unused to projection, came out stronger than he expected. "These papers prove the water rights on Cedar Creek belonged to Nika Jessup. They were never sold, never transferred. The railroad's claim is false." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Agent Cutter stepped forward, his smooth manner barely masking his irritation. "My good man, surely you don't expect us to take the word of a mountain recluse over properly filed railroad documents?" "Not my word." Mark opened the folder, revealing his father's careful drawings and notarized stamps. "These are the original survey maps done by my father 20 years ago. Every water claim in this valley is recorded here, witnessed and legal." Deputy Harlan barked a laugh. "You're making a fool of yourself, Boone. Ain't nobody going to. I vouch for these documents." Pastor Higgins's voice rang clear as he stepped out from the crowd. He moved to stand beside Mark, his presence lending authority. "These surveys were entrusted to the church records. Every mark and signature is genuine." The townsfolk pressed closer, their whispers growing louder. Mark saw recognition in their eyes. Many remembered his father's work, his reputation for honest dealing. "Sheriff." Wilson pushed through the crowd, his badge catching the morning light. He examined the maps carefully while Agent Cutter shifted impatiently. "These are legal and binding," the sheriff announced. "The water rights belong to Mrs. Jessup. Any claim otherwise is false." The deputy's face darkened. "You can't seriously." "I can and do." The sheriff's voice hardened. "Unless the railroad wants to dispute these documents in court, this matter is settled." Agent Cutter's smooth facade cracked. He glanced at his men, then at the watching crowd. What he saw made him step back, not fear exactly, but the recognition that this battle was lost. The townspeople had chosen their side. "This is highly irregular," he muttered. "The company will hear of this." "Let them hear," Mark said quietly. "Truth stands its ground." The agent retreated to his wagon, gesturing sharply for his men to follow. Deputy Harlan lingered, his face twisted with humiliation. "You'll regret this, Boone," he spat. But his words carried no weight now. As the railroad men departed, something remarkable happened. Old Jim from the mercantile tipped his hat to Mark. Sarah, who ran the boarding house, smiled warmly. "One by one." The townspeople nodded or touched their hats, small gestures that spoke volumes. They no longer saw a hermit or a fool, but a man who had stood for justice. The morning sun climbed higher, glinting off fresh snow on the distant peaks. Mark carefully folded the maps, his hand steady now. He had done what needed doing. For the first time in his life, he stood tall among his neighbors, no longer hiding. In the shadows of his mountain. Pastor Higgins clasped his shoulder. "Your father would be proud, son. You've done right by his memory and by Mrs. Jessup." Mark nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He mounted his mule as the crowd began to disperse, their excited talk carrying on the crisp air. The deputies' dark figures slouched away toward the saloon, defeat evident in every step. The truth had won out, just as his father always said it would. Mark turned his mule toward home, feeling the weight of years of isolation falling away with each step. He had found his voice, his courage, And perhaps something more, a place among these people who had witnessed him stand strong. Mark urged his mule up the snowy trail toward home, his mind still buzzing from the confrontation in town. The morning's victory felt almost dreamlike now. His father's maps lay safe in his saddlebag, their yellowed edges a testament to years of patient waiting for the right moment. The winter sun hung low in the afternoon sky, casting long shadows through the pines. His thoughts drifted to Nika and her boy, wondering if they had found shelter in the next town. The ache in his chest had grown sharper with each passing hour since their departure. Even his mule seemed to plod more slowly, as if sharing his reluctance to return to an empty cabin. As he rounded the final bend, Mark pulled his mule to a sudden halt. There by his barn stood a familiar wagon, and beside it, his heart leaped Nika and her boy. They were bundled against the cold, their breaths forming small clouds in the winter air. The boy spotted him first, pointing excitedly. "Mama, look! He's back!" Mark dismounted with trembling hands, hardly daring to believe his eyes. Nika stepped forward, her cheeks pink from the cold, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "We never made it past Miller's Creek," she admitted softly. "The storm was building, but that wasn't really why we turned back." She wrung her hands, a gesture he had come to know well. "I prayed for a sign, Mark. Asked the Lord to show me if we were running from something good instead of towards something better." The boy bounced on his toes, unable to contain himself. "And then folks riding past told us what you did in town. How you stood up to those railroad men." Mark swallowed hard, finding his voice. "The creek rights are yours, proper and legal. Nobody can take them now. The water rights don't matter half as much as what you did," Nika said, taking a step closer. Her voice grew softer, more certain. "Mark Boone, we don't want just your barn. We want you." The simple truth of her words struck him like summer lightning. All his years of solitude, of hiding from life, seemed to fall away. With newfound confidence, Mark reached for her hand. His calloused fingers found hers, warm and sure. The boy let out a whoop of joy and launched himself at them both, his small arms stretching to encompass them in an exuberant hug. His laughter rang out across the snow-covered yard, pure and bright as sleigh bells. Mark found himself laughing too, a deep, rusty sound that surprised him with its freedom. Nika smiled up at him through happy tears. "What do you say? Should we unpack the wagon? This time for good?" Mark nodded, his heart too full for words. Together, they carried Nika's trunks and boxes into the cabin. Each item seemed to transform the space. Her quilt draped over his chair, her boy's wooden soldiers lined up on the mantel, her dried herbs hanging beside his rifle. The cabin that had felt so hollow that morning now hummed with life. The fire crackled welcome in the hearth as Nika moved about the kitchen, the familiar scent of coffee mixing with the promise of fresh bread. Her boy chattered happily, helping Mark stack firewood by the stove. What had been just shelter was becoming something more, a home warm and alive with the sound of family. Mark watched them settle in, knowing with bone-deep certainty that his years of solitude were over. God had answered not just Nika's prayers, but his own long silent ones as well. Steam rose from bowls of rabbit stew as the family gathered around Mark's worn oak table. The cabin felt different now, warmer somehow, filled with the kind of life he'd only dreamed about during his solitary years. Nika had added carrots and wild herbs from her stores, making the simple meal taste like something special. "Come spring, can we plant a garden?" her boy asked between eager spoonfuls. "And maybe raise some chickens? Billy Thompson says their hens lay eggs every single day." Mark smiled, watching Nika ladle out seconds. "Reckon we could manage that. Might even build you a proper hen house." After the dishes were cleared, Mark's heart thundered in his chest. 40 years he'd waited for this moment. With trembling fingers, he reached for Nika's hand, drawing her close by the firelight. Her eyes held nothing but tenderness as he leaned in, pressing his lips to hers in a gentle, hesitant kiss. I ain't ever, he started, cheeks flushing. Hush, Nico whispered, squeezing his hand. Your heart's what matters, Mark Boone, nothing else. Together, they knelt by the hearth, the boy nestled between them. Their prayers rose soft and sincere, asking God's blessing on this new family. Outside, snow drifted past the windows, but inside, the cabin glowed with warmth, peace, and promise fulfilled. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.